So first, before we start our panel, I wanted to thank Mary Bernard, who set everything up, all the food, audio, visuals, everything else. So thank you very much. You did a great job. And, yeah, this is working out really well. Thank you, Mary. The last panel is called Coming to Terms with America's Past. Rosewood Massacre, Male Anxiety, and Disney History. Okay, our first speaker, Stearns, is from Tampa, right? And a history major. No minors? No minors. A straight history major. And he plans to go to graduate school for museum studies, hence the public history angle, you'll notice, and would like to be a curator at some point of the American Museum. His paper, you have the title? If you have the title, I will let you read it. And floor is yours.
Okay, so hello everybody. I will be talking about the Rosewood exception, a unique case of race, class, and violence in the interwar South. And the historical questions that I'll be focusing on are, how is the Rosewood Massacre a unique case of Southern race relations? And can the events at Rosewood in 1923 be defined as a race riot instead of just a massacre? So first, here's a map of Rosewood in 1923, and just a couple of key points that I'd like to focus on are the Masonic Hall, which I'll talk about later on, and the Seaboard Airline Railway, which I'll also talk about later on, and then finally the Carrier Household. And in case you all are wondering where Rosewood is, here's a map of Rosewood. You can see where it is in regards to Florida, and there it is down there. And a couple key places to remember are Sumner, which is located just a couple miles away from Rosewood. That was where most of the white mob came from that would come to attack the town of Rosewood. And you got Gainesville over here, which is where most of the Associated Press news reports are coming out of during the week of the massacre. And then Perry up here, which was where a race riot took place about 3 weeks before Rosewood happened in December of 1922. And just to go over a little bit about what happened at the Rosewood Massacre, it took place from January 1st to January 7th of 1923. And basically how it started was this white woman that lived in nearby Sumner, Fannie Taylor, she accused this black man who was from Rosewood, Jesse Hunter, of raping her. So then a white mob forms in response to this, and it first decides to go and find Aaron Carrier, who was the nephew of Sarah Carrier, who was Fannie Taylor's black seamstress. And this mob takes, they take Carrier and they're dragging him along the road on the way to Sumner. And then the Levi County Sheriff, Bob Walker, he comes and removes Carrier from the mob and says that he'll take care of Carrier himself, and he drives him to safety at the county seat of Bronson. And this is the first example why I want to point out that this is an exceptional case, because you rarely see a sheriff actually trying to protect a black person during this kind of event. And then later on in the day, they find Sam Carter, who was a local blacksmith, and they think that Carter knows where Jesse Hunter is. But they don't believe his story. They end up shooting him and lynching him. But the interesting point of this all is that survivors believe that Carter actually helped the white man who did rape Fannie Taylor. He worked on the railroad, and the interesting point of this was that both of them were Masons, which this is an exceptional example, because if you look at this event and then also the Perry race riot, which took place in 1922, and then also in Florida a year before the Ocoee riot, in all three of these examples you have the Masonic lodges being burned down to the ground. So the fact that a black Mason and a white Mason would come together when this kind of a thing was happening was quite remarkable. And then on January 2nd and 3rd, there isn't any violence that happens because 1.5 inches of rain comes down. which is something that historians have often overlooked, and I think it should be something that should be focused more on because it gives time for the mob to grow in size and also become more angry. They have frustrations and they want to act these out. And then they go to the Carrier home on January 4th, despite the fact that Sheriff Walker and then the mill supervisor in Sumner, W.H. Pillsbury, they both try to stop the mob from causing any more violence, but they end up going to the Carrier household, and basically this like shoot-off ensues between Sylvester Carrier and a couple of other black men and this white mob of around 20 to 30 people. And it lasts throughout the day on January 4th, into the night, and into the morning on January 5th. And basically what happens is both Sylvester and Sarah Carrier and then two white men who tried to break into the house during the shoot-off, they were all killed as a result of the violence. And basically at this point, this is when a bunch of news accounts start coming out of Gainesville, and they get spread throughout the whole country of what had happened at the Carrier house and what is going on in Rosewood. And men from all over the South literally come together to form this mob of about 300 to 400 people. And then from January 5th to 7th, they ensued to destroy every community building and black house that was in Rosewood. And as a result, the black members of Rosewood, they're forced to leave the town and they have to go out into the woods for safety. And then my last point here is that historians agreed on that 6 black people and 2 white people were killed at Rosewood, but survivors and descendants have said that there were likely more people who were killed. Arnett Doctor, who was a Rosewood descendant, he's heard a story of how there was this like gigantic tractor that basically buried black bodies into a grave, about 30 black bodies. And then also Minnie Lee Langley, who was a Rosewood survivor, she was in the house during the Carrier standoff, and she remembers going outside on her porch and seeing literally bodies of white men sprayed out all throughout the porch and the yard. And then I'm just going to go into here some of the white heroes of Rosewood, which help make this an exceptional case. You have the Bryce brothers. They were local train conductors. As I said before, you have the railroad that goes through Rosewood. So they were able to get a train to help Rosewood women and children flee to safety in Gainesville. Now, they didn't take men, and that was because they were worried that there could be more violence if that happened, if the white people found out that this train was going through. And that was why they just took women and children. And then talked about Pillsbury, that he told the black workers that were working at his mill to not leave it at all throughout the violence due to safety reasons. And then you have Sheriff Walker. He told black people in Rosewood not to go back to Rosewood after they were hiding out in the woods because some wanted to return and see what had happened. But the mob had gotten so violent at this point that he just felt that it was in their best interest if they didn't go back to the town, because they were likely going to shoot whoever came back to the town. And then also you have John and Mary Jo Wright. They were the owners of the Rosewood General Store, and they hid blacks in their home throughout the event, and they also helped get them safely to the train. And just a little bit on the historiographical debates. You have Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote in the 1940s that race riots were primarily a northern and urban phenomenon, and that lynchings primarily occurred in just rural southern areas. And then we have Pfeiffer, who says that, like I said before, the police almost always sided with, and they even participated in the white mob. So that makes the actions of Sheriff Walker quite incredible when you really think about that. And then you have Note, Fine, and Turner. They say that white mobs, they often become fueled by rumors, which this mob certainly was by the rape rumor, and that they easily become irrational, which you saw with the intensity of the violence throughout the week. And then Diorso, who says that race riots in reality are just large-scale lynchings. And then just a little bit about the definitions of massacres and race riots. As far as you see here, the definition of massacre, it basically is just referring to a brutal slaughter of people. This really doesn't give blacks agency who fought back in the standoff at the Carrier home. And then with race riot, it's basically just members of different races in the same community fighting each other, which I feel is more appropriate since you have the Carriers and the men who are in their house fighting off against the whites and Sumner. And then you also have the whole community becoming refugees and the town being burned down to the ground as well. And the newspaper accounts too also called this a race riot at the time too, like the Gainesville Daily Sun, Chicago Tribune, New York Times. And the black newspapers did as well, although they obviously took a different spin on it, saying how brutal the white mob was and everything. And today, most scholarly newspaper accounts, they've tended to call the events at Rosewood a massacre. They don't really call it a race riot, although one historian, Edward Gonzalez Tennant, he's called it a race riot and even a pogrom in one account. And another historian, Steverson, he also calls it a riot due to the mob violence and the collective intentional loss of memory of the events by Rosewood survivors, because they didn't talk about it for about 60 years after the events happened. Then there's a couple pictures of the destruction. And this is a marker that was put up in 1996 at Rosewood. And just an interesting thing to point out too, over here is where John Wright's house is, and that's still the only structure left from 1923 because he and his wife are white, so they didn't burn down their house. Then just my conclusions here is that I feel that Rosewood is a unique case study as a Southern massacre. That's because of the Masonic connection, the break of violence due to weather, the railroad's assistance through the Bryce brothers and helping save Rosewood refugees, and then the actions of Sheriff Walker. And also the fact that the Carriers attempted to fight off the white mob and that the whole town was burned down to the ground. So that's why I believe it should be considered a race riot instead of just a massacre. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Gowan. Like many of the papers today, I would only know this. Even since last week when we did our last peer review, I've seen clear strides in the argument and everything else. So well done, everybody. That was really good. So Jeremiah Fues is next. I don't believe you emailed me any information about your.
I can introduce myself.
If you want to do it quickly, go ahead, Jeremiah. What do you want to do after?
Well, my name is Jeremiah Fues. I'm a double major in history and American studies. I'm also a double minor in economics and psychology. My plans after graduating are to look into attending law school. Also currently looking into dual degree programs as far as pursuing my JD and master's in history and leadership.
And your title is Father's Little Helper, Capitalism, Consumerism, and the Treatment of Male Anxiety in America, 1950 to 1970. And there it is.
Yes, okay, so I wasn't able to get an intro, but to reiterate once more, the title of my research is Father's Little Helper, Capitalism, Consumerism, and the Treatment of Male Anxiety in America, 1950s and 70s. So as you can kind of tell, what I try to do with my senior research is kind of synthesize everything that I've learned over the course of the 4 years through my majors and minors. Okay, so in case, for those of you who don't know, anxiety as it's understood as a social construct, its focus in the literature is focused on females. There's not much of evidence on males and really why they are underrepresented. Largely because when social historians talk about anxiety and its relations to gender, it's more so with this thesis or this argument that the reason why females are more diagnosed and treated with anxiety and its medications is because during this time, as most of you historians know, this is a time where you have feminism, Cold War politics, things like this. And this is also a time where Americans are trying to bring back some of the traditional gender norms of the time. So this is women, cult of domesticity, women being in the home, and this disgruntlement is leading women to feel this anxiety, and thus this kind of coincides with this magic little pill that they produce. And once you take that magic little pill, all of a sudden your worries go away. I don't want to work outside the home. I don't want to pursue politics. I don't want to be an executive. And so that's kind of I know that's a little bit of a humorous way of explaining it, but you got to go through the gist of things because there's a lot, and unfortunately I only have 10 minutes. But, interestingly enough, in the 1950s, it's not necessarily the case that it's females that are targeted. You have to also understand that there are also there are other factors, more so than just the gender ideas, that are at play. And so, another reason why I choose this as a case study is because this is the time where we have our first production of FDA-regulated tranquilizers for the purpose treatment of anxiety, which is something in prior cases, at least with the neurasthenia that some of you might be familiar with, is not the case. So at least it provides my analysis with a sense of control. Now, my argument here is that pretty much what I've kind of already said is that there are potentially more factors than just gender norms as to why males are underrepresented. In my attempts here, I'm not trying to say that the answer is this. It's more so to highlight male anxiety and highlight these factors and to pretty much offer how much it's a little bit more complicated than what the historiography so far has indicated. So, in that regard, this is some of the biggest secondary sources I've used for historiography. David Hertzberg, Happy Pills in America, as you can see by the little emoticon. He pretty much talked about, it's a very interesting topic. His debate is more so, he focuses on anxiety as a social construct. He also ties in ideas of gender, but he also ties in pretty much how tranquilizers became a vehicle of understanding the dynamics between gender norms and consumer society. And also, interestingly enough, he brings in the class element as far as showing how anxiety was treated more so for middle-class Americans in his point of view, and how, just because of the costs involved in receiving treatment, and how lower economic status individuals resorted to illegal drugs. And so he actually has a little bit of interesting topics on drug wars and how that relates in present day. Jonathan Metzl, his is Prozac on the couch. As you can tell just from the cover, his is more so on the women in the main focus. Pretty much talking about how, or bringing up the thesis argument that anxiety as it's treated is more so targeted towards women, and this is more so to kind of quell women's dissatisfaction. He also brings about primary sources looking at feminist arguments at the time and the way that the feminist movement used this discourse as far as tranquilizers and its relation to anxiety as a way of, I guess, empowerment or to move over the political message. And then Andrea Tone does a really great synthesis or history of the age of anxiety, as the title of her book is called. She talks about anxiety and gender, just like David Hertzberg. Both of them kind of rely upon a lot of the same sources, but she also brings in a lot of the consumer culture, mass consumption ideas as far as anxiety, and the reason why there's such a huge burst of people taking these drugs and things like that is because it's like instant gratification. This is a mass consumer society. Everybody's moving fast-paced. And so you take this magic pill, it'll make you feel better, and it just kind of ties into advertising and things like that. I know this is kind of brief, I'm just kind of, there's a lot more into it. So my methodology, as far as analyzing more concretely, improving my argument, I look at economic, sociocultural, and scientific factors. Now, my points of departure, as you could probably tell from the ways which I described the historiography, Hertzberg and Andrea Tone mentioned the economic and sociocultural factors. But it's more so focused just specifically on ideas of gender of that time and how they interplay with each other. By reading of this, you'll see it later on as I discuss some of the primary sources. At least with the economic factor, I kind of point out the argument that they forget that there could have been a real economic need for it. So for the sense of time, I kind of want to illustrate it with a graph. So let's say, this is kind of economics 101 in case you forgot. So let's say you have a market and you have supply, demand, this is equilibrium, okay? So this is a non-regulated market, okay? So we're going to say anxiety and its treatment prior to the 1950s, where you do not have commercialized medicine, its production, and FDA regulation. Okay, we'll say it's right here. So let's say this is neurasthenia times. This is where you have elixirs, herbs, things like that. Stuff that's not scientifically proven as effective, could be placebo effects. But let's say it's right here. So you can see that it's not at equilibrium. And well, actually, it should be written in reverse. It's actually more so supply is not there. Anyway. But at the time of the 1950s, when we have your first minor tranquilizer production, which is microbramate in the 1950s, what happens is the supply shifts over to the demand. So really, its supply is here, okay, and then supply eventually moves over to here to equilibrium. So, thus, what we're talking about is that scientists, when Frank Berger discovered the first minor tranquilizer to be used for anxiety treatment in the 1950s. He kind of found it, as most scientific discoveries, haphazard. He was looking for something else. And they discovered its relaxing capabilities and sedative type qualities, and eventually he eventually marketed it. And pretty much what I'm trying to say is there was a supply need for the medications. And that in reality, why men were seeking treatment in the beginning in the 1950s was because they finally had something to treat it with, something that was the least safe and at least mindset as being tested and things like that. Socioculturals, the gender norms and things like that. And as far as my primary sources, I bring in a lot of the scientific side of this because this is more so my subtlety in my argument in trying to show the actual impact of treatment. That's something that the historiography doesn't really focus on, is the impact of the treatment and realizing that it is a medical reality. That's very skeptical about anxiety at this time for these secondary sources, and my thinking of it is, well, perhaps this is real problems for these people. And so I've concluded a lot of scientific studies that show the efficacy of these drugs, at least in the 1950s, which is one probably was the most popular in, for males. And then I also included, some of you might be noticing, oh my goodness, there's an article in 2003, that's not 1950s, 1970s. Well, it's because I am also trying to bring in sort of the medical knowledge that we have today as far as proving why men were underrepresented back in the past. And so in that study, and this is just one, there's actually like 6 over the course of the 2000s that have kind of showed this, is that testosterone actually plays a factor in actually inhibiting anxiety in males. And that lower levels of testosterone in males is actually correlated to males experiencing higher amounts of anxiety and its physiological symptoms. Now, of course, a lot of you are thinking, well, this is kind of like science and things like that, but at least it's a causation and correlation, and it kind of helps provide a point of departure, at least from most historiography. Then I also included Henry Hoyt, who kind of provided his antitrust and monopoly subcommittee hearings helped provide some of the economic data that I needed as far as finding revenue that companies were making during this time for these types of drugs. Unfortunately, out of sake of time, I can't really go over some of the advertising that were used, but you can see how there was an interplay with the factors of socioeconomics and also using science as a way to advertise the effectiveness of these types of medications. This is an ad from Milltown. It's in the early 1950s. This one kind of highlights the mass consumer culture. This one is actually from Hertzberg and Antone. they both use that one. And this one is one that they both don't use, but brings up kind of the play that advertisers are using, at least at first in its initial development in the 1950s, of the scientific efficacy of these drugs. And then more so we have in the 1960s and 70s where men all of a sudden were thinking that anxiety was something important to have, that it brought that edginess, that kind of alertness that was needed in order, and it was kind of the way that they described it was social commentators and even some physicians even said that anxiety was something that men needed in order to be effective in achieving. So it was kind of equated to that trailblazer personality type of America. One physician said if Christopher Columbus was doped up on Milltown, he probably would have never went to find the New World. So that's some of the criticisms. Another point of departure, at least for the socioeconomic ones, was that I at least point out that, well, there's evident, well, I probably won't have time to mention questions, but at least with this advertisement, we at least wanted to show how the way they advertised it is, you know, this is caveman, this is a caveman, there's a tiger, there's a high rate of anxiety, it was producing these physiological symptoms. But then the problem is that society is producing the same amount of anxiety that's somehow debilitating, provide impairment in daily functioning. So we need to quell that, and this is not going to reduce man's alertness. So it's kind of interesting how advertisers change that. But anyway, my conclusion is the same as my thesis, that there are more factors than just gender norms and sociocultural, I guess, factors, and that there is some subtleties in scientific recent research that helps to explain the differences as far as back then white males were underrepresented.
The difference from your first presentation to this, wow, very impressive, right? What were you reading from notes, right?
Well, no, it was all.
That's all in your head?
No, yeah.
Well done. I wish we had more time. We'd all like to see that.
You can go.
Yeah. All right. Christian has the unenviable task of going last in a 4-hour presentation series. But he's only a few minutes away, and you're all a few minutes away from pizza or other freedom. So we can think about that while Christian is talking about something that's also very interesting. Disney. So you've got pizza and Disney on the horizon for the next 10 minutes. So that's a good thing. Christian's from DeBerry.
Longest travel.
Also a history and political science major. And I think we have 4 or 5 this semester. So that's great. Thanks to the poli-sci department that they're so covetous of their majors that we have these great papers in history that combine both. So, Christian would like to get a master's in public administration and potentially community and regional planning. And he hasn't yet decided where. It could be Florida, it could be Oregon. Oregon, more likely.
Somewhere in the middle.
Portlandia. And the title is Reimagining History, Disney's America and Corporate Interpretation of History. Okay. The past and the corporate interpretation.
Okay. So, like Dr. Curlinger said, my name is Christian, and the title is Disney's America, Reimagining the Past and the Corporate Interpretation of History. Anyway, so the question that I was looking at essentially was how well Disney, a corporation that we know for creating and representing fiction, and whose primary focus is entertainment and also making profit, can be the stewards of American history and can present this history. So before going into all my sources and things like that, I wanted to talk about Disney's America, what the project was, what it would have looked like. So in 1993, Michael Eisner, president of the time of the Disney Corporation, wanted to make a new kind of theme park that would explore and exhibit American history. And initially, what he was talking about was including everything from, talking about all of our great victories to even the painful, agonizing, and disturbing experience of slavery. And guests would be able to escape through an underground railroad and things like that. everything you want when you go to a theme park. But this was quickly met with opposition from academic historians who came together as a group. Notable historians like David McCullough, Shelby Foote, and the like came together with organizations like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and pushed Michael Eisner away from this idea, where he then moved almost solely to celebratory history, is what I'm going to call it. Just some of the examples of what he was looking at was Civil War village, where you'd have reenactments, Native American village with Lewis and Clark themed raft ride, factory towns, Victory Field, Ellis Island to celebrate the immigrant experience, and President Square, which would have transplanted things like, the Hall of Presidents. So, and I wanted to include this too, just to show you where it was planned. In Haymarket, Virginia, in Prince William County, just 3 miles away from Manassas National Battlefield Park, which has a whole other layer of opposition there. But, so, historiography. I looked at a number of sources, and like most of these won't be exhaustive, but some of the ones I wanted to focus on. Carrie Carson, who was actually an executive at Colonial Williamsburg, she talked about a few things. One big just question I just wanted to address that she puts out there is what this was really about is who are history's rightful teachers, and who has the right, basically, is what this is focused on, to present history. And also, she points out, and I want to focus on, people who are frequenting these museums and theme parks, they have a clear understanding of what they're to expect, and they're going to adjust their expectations. So, going forward, I also looked at Richard Francaviglia, who talks about holding theme parks and museums to different standards. Museums are employing strict methodologies. They're putting together exhibits, whereas theme parks are visualizing, and he goes into this as well. They're visualizing some things academic historians are looking for, major themes, events, and symbols that are defining our culture. On the other end, Michael Wallace is saying, yeah, roads are great, you can put people through a steel mill, but are you going to, as Eisner had originally planned, talking about more inclusive or more extensive history, are you going to put exhibits outside of a roller coaster that takes you through a factory that shows you the lives of the workers, the battles to form unions, things like that. And then also, interestingly, he's talking about it's not Disney's techniques, but they have to maintain a non-controversial image. So can you really confront history honestly or the way that professional historians would want you to? The last two I mentioned only because this was also a land use battle. The fourth battle of Manassas, if you will, the first two being Civil War battles, the latter being land use battles, like I say. And then I briefly mentioned in the paper about folk song and urban sprawl, just to go into the opposition. So chronology is 1993 to the present, so I'm calling myself historical, my lifetime. And it's just covering Disney's America through case studies, which I forgot to mention yet. So I'm also looking at case studies since Disney's America went on to fail due largely, I believe, to negative publicity, which wouldn't have made it profitable. Not necessarily they weren't going to show these positive things well, but that it wasn't going to be profitable, and there are appropriations driven by that. So just some of the primary sources I was looking at was newspapers, big newspapers that got a lot of national attention, New York Times, Washington Post. Press releases, obviously mostly Disney, but also interest groups like the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And then I include this Senate subcommittee hearing, just like I said, I go briefly into it. But it did go all the way to Congress to have a local zoning issue approved, basically. So while Disney's America failed, and I said why I thought that, they didn't give up necessarily. In 2001, they opened the California Adventure. And what I talk about in my paper as this being is a kind of a move towards a celebratory history of state rather than a national level, and it's really a celebration of the state as a whole, focusing more on time periods that were good for the state, landmarks that are representative of it, and places like that. So this is the entrance. It's the Golden Gate Bridge, California, big gold letters, the Golden State. And then looking at some of the other things, we have Paradise Pier, which after a while was actually modeled after a Victorian pier, so it's talking about a Victorian time period. the Hollywood backlot, which focuses on Hollywood and its golden age, and and the Grizzly River Run, which is actually, I think, a direct transplant from that Lewis and Clark raft ride, right into California adventure. So it's kind of a move towards a different way. I believe that they realized that they didn't want to tackle all the issues, so they moved towards the positive, basically. Oh, sorry. But anyway, so the other thing I looked like, and I would have liked to look at it more, but it's in development now, is Disney Springs, reimagining, as Disney would say it, of the downtown Disney area, that gives really a theme park scale story to a retail area. And what it is it's a stereotypic or a generalized story of a late 19th century Florida town that's founded around a spring and then grows and grows and becomes this space. It focuses on architecture, music, and costumes like most Disney areas do. You're not exposed to the outside environment, and it's a celebration essentially of old Florida and things like that. So, in my conclusions, I tried to stress that it's not a question of should, which is what a lot of historians at the time had talked about, but rather how well Disney can portray history. I also really put on to this different set of standards ideas. I think by looking at the California Adventure, we see an abandonment of these more serious topics, which are definitely necessary to look at, but Disney not as a museum, accepting its role as a theme park, but also as has a wide audience. It can do this, and I just wanted to conclude by saying a large portion of Americans experience history through entertainment. It's a proven fact. So with this in mind, I believe that Disney and its themed areas and rides could effectively present a broad interpretation of history in a good way. I yielded it to Jeremiah.
We averaged the two. It's very close. All right, excellent. Have a seat. And
do you have anything more to say?
Oh, good. We have a question. So, I don't know what to hand up first. Now, okay. So, Dr. Fowler, Dr. Croce, Dr. Mirez, Miracle, and we'll go from there.
Thanks so much, you guys. Great panel. Just a quick question for Christian. What have you just seen project? So I'm wondering, I know, it's sort of fun. Who is Disney in your project? And who are these people making these decisions? And are there Disney archives? And is it possible to get access to them to read the decision-making process on? Now it's continuing on these projects.
We're entering.
We'll start out with
Okay.
the serial one. Yeah, go ahead.
So, who is Disney? That's a good question. So, who I was really looking at was mostly the executives who are making these decisions, and also that wonderful department of Imagineering. So,
Yeah.
which is just rather than including historians, which they did actually later go on to make an effort to include them, even though that the project never did come out. Eventually, they put out invitations. But anyway, so I'm just looking at executives. Carrie Carson actually tells a funny story of Colonial Williamsburg and Disney people, like Disney executives, coming together, where there's a long line of gray suits that are Colonial Williamsburg, and then on the other side is Disney with their sports jackets and Dumbo ties, and I think she says names that rival the Seven Dwarfs, things like that. But it's these people, who are just, it's all about the creativity sometimes rather than the focus on that. In regards to the archives, I found something like an archives, but it's not really accessible unless you work there or you have a connection there, kind of thing. I think that was that question.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Croce.
Yeah, thanks again to all of you. And first to Dylan, I wonder if you could say anything about the prior success or not of African Americans before this tragic act. And if I could just drill out a couple other questions for the others. For Jeremiah, did you look at neurasthenia, like prior views of men having mental issues that might undercut their ability to be good workers? And I guess the last question I'll add would be, Christian, you've got academics objecting to Disney. You've got top-down history people objecting to Disney's view of history. Was that their reason for not doing it, or did Eisner just say, I don't think this is going to be popular or profitable? Could it have been bottom-up popular, even though it was very clearly objected to by the top-down folks? I'll stop.
Okay. Want to quickly?
Sure. Okay, in regards to the prior successes of African Americans who lived at Rosewood, I mean, yeah, they definitely were successful in a lot of ways because they were able to form their own community. They lived on their own. Many of them worked on their own farms. They didn't work under white people who lived around the area. I mean, some did, but they were successful in that regard, I would say. And then I also look at, too, in my paper, some of the financial motivations of the mob and attacking Rosewood due to the fact that they would have wanted the land for their own use and just to try to kick the African Americans who were living in Rosewood out of that area because they were successful and had their own homes and farms and everything.
I'm glad you asked about neurasthenia because I did include this section in my paper about neurasthenia. I just included I did include it because I used that as another additional case study to also look at continuity and discontinuity as far as because neurasthenia is the way that it's kind of described back then. A lot of the symptoms, we're kind of talking about the same thing as far as then in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then to the middle of the 20th century. So there was, I have looked at the issues of men having, as far as performing during work, to be very similar to, somewhat to be similar to issues that men had as far as like things that supposedly produce anxiety. And a lot of the treatments differed for men during that time. More so physicians talked about, provided like, herbs or like getting back to nature, that their mind is overtaxed type of thing. And then of course, this is during a time where you can see a lot of like elixirs that are kind of sold kind of in drugstores, things like that, that may not have, as far as scientific evidence of pure efficacy, but at least that was a form of treatment for men as well. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
And to make them better workers. Did it have the same tone in the mid-20th century? We're going to make you better workers.
Oh, okay, yes. Okay, more specifically. In the neurasthenia case, that for men it was more so, there are arguments that yes, it was for the sake of making like a better worker, but there are also during that time ideas of like race suicide, so those kind of played into men feeling that pressure and that they're all of a sudden being overtaxed. There's a lot of like race involved, I think, in that narrative as well that played a part.
Well, just one point I don't think you made in the presentation or here that you make in the paper, it's less gendered. So neurasthenia was very much a... The reality was it was fairly democratic.
At least in the initial treatment of it, and then, as it goes, but that's...
Good.
Okay, so was it bottom-up popular? First of all, I'll note that the government jumped on board right away. Like the county government jumped on board right away. They approved everything that Disney put in front of them pretty much. But one of the groups that was in opposition, actually, I guess living around this area was and Michael Eisner noted he didn't know as many wealthy people lived around there as were there. So wealthy citizens who lived around the area actually came together and formed a group called Piedmont Environmental Council, rallying under that cause, and they were also, like I say, opposed to it, and they put a lot of money into opposing it.
So let's collect the next two sets of questions or questions. So Dr. Maris, go ahead.
So these projects are really great, and I just find them fascinating. They're kind of right up my alley. So I have a couple of points for all of you, or sort of questions, to the extent that you want to address them. So Dylan, I think it's really interesting the way you're looking at Rosewood and this question of what to call it. And I think also one of the reasons maybe that, and you might talk about this more in your larger paper, but one of the reasons that's important when we call it a race riot is then we also have to understand it in a larger context of all the race riots that were happening nationally in that time period, post-World War I. And so I wonder if that's something to think about and address. Jeremiah, this is all really fascinating. Of course, I think everything is about gender, so I guess I would push you to sort of think maybe in your answer a little bit more about the connections between gender and science. So even this idea of efficiency in that awesome Milltown ad from the 50s, that's a gender notion, right? And then all of this also, I think, ties into these gendered conceptions of the nation that you were actually kind of harking back to with the race suicide idea, ideas from the 19th century and then the early 20th, and then in the Cold War period about how the United States had to be a stronger nation and then sort of masculinize itself. And that's a little less direct in some of the rhetoric, but I think some of that is still there. And then also I wonder to what extent some of the questions scientists were asking were inherently shaped by conceptions of gender themselves, right? So kind of questioning the objectivity of science. And Christian, I think this is so cool. I don't understand why I never heard of Disney Springs before, so we'll have to talk about that a lot more because I'm very intrigued. But I was thinking, you said at the end that you were a little bit, it sounds like you're a little bit sympathetic to this idea of having some kind of entertainment version of history, right? So I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what that would look like. What kind of version of history can you have in an entertainment context that isn't leaving out so much that it just reproduces the same kind of problems that we have in sort of mass culture views of history anyway? How would you deal with those things? Right? So yeah, so great work, everyone. Really interesting.
Excellent. So do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Well, I have a question for Christian. Given Disney's animated attempts at history from things such as Pocahontas and Mulan and Song of the South, how do you think Disney tries to, in Peter Pan, what do you think about Disney's approach to how there has been backlash for their interpretation of history through film, and does that factor into your paper in any sort of way?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mears. Yes, I do talk about other race riots, and I'll just give a couple of examples now, both one in a large city and then another one in a small town. So first, one race riot that I studied was the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot of 1921, and that one, it started actually the same way as the Rosewood riot did. You have a white woman accusing a black man of raping her, and then it lasts over a couple of days, and basically you have the entire Greenwood neighborhood, which was an all-black neighborhood in Tulsa, being burned down to the ground. And then also throughout those couple of days, you see the black residents of Greenwood fighting back against the white mob. So that would be one example. And then one that I talked about a little bit, which happened just before Rosewood, was the Perry riot of 1922, which happened just a couple weeks before Rosewood, and it was actually right near Rosewood as well. And that one started the same way. Basically, there was a rape accusation, and then you have basically about the entire black section of Perry being burned down to the ground as well. And just like Rosewood, almost all the residents of Perry being forced to evacuate and become refugees as well. So that's how I think Rosewood is similar to both of those cases.
Okay, so Dr. Mieres, there of course is a lot of overlay as far as those ideas of like gender conception and that of the nation, especially in that neurasthenia sense case. and there's a lot of interplay, at least in like the methodology that I was using. But I, like I said before, I wasn't really trying to say that, or kind of say that, oh, it's really gender, or ideas of it. I was really trying to provide kind of a subtlety, a little bit of a nuance to it, and say, well, yeah, that might be a big majority of it, but maybe there's something else that maybe isn't really being highlighted. And so that was kind of the point of, because I noticed a lot of what you're saying, and you've obviously read Andrea Tone and her work. But a lot of what I was saying was what the secondary sources, the historiography, they do mention those things. And so I was trying to provide kind of that subtle nuance that it wasn't just those things, or also looking at some of the factors that they were using and say, well, maybe they didn't go far enough, or maybe they weren't looking entirely enough. Because I also saw, at least with Andrea Tone and actually with all three of them that I mentioned, at least I mentioned the Cold War politics of it, and I also bring in like secondary sources like Elaine Tyler May and Homeward Bound, but they don't really talk about that. And one of the biggest things is they never really talk about the impact of treatments and things like that. Yes, you do have a point that there were some physicians that had kind of a gendered bias. I did point out to you guys in that presentation the one about Christopher Columbus not going discover the New World if he was doped on, things like that, kind of highlighting the need for male anxiety, and that gives them that trailblazing achiever mentality. So yes, there was an interplay, and that's what kind of helped, and this is why it's so complex, is at least for like advertising, they were able to use ideas of gender and even science to help promote these messages. But at least I was trying to show that there was at least a medical reality for the basis of treatment. And that was kind of the reason why there's this initial representation of men as far as being treated with anxiety that all of a sudden begins to decline as it becomes more so gendered with women, as well as, you're quite familiar with that, so I'm not trying to waste other people's time publicity. So at least that's what I'm trying to do, and there's a lot more to it that I included in my paper as far as etiology and as far as what we know of anxiety today, because what we know of the way it's described back then, they tried to make it objective. This is a time where psychology itself is young, and psychodynamics, psychoanalysis is still predominantly, at least for mental health, their approach to things, but they were at least trying to be objective with it. And this type of, and you can tell that at least for some of the medical journal articles and things from doctors themselves, like memoirs and things like that, when they talked about treatment of anxiety, they did mention how, at least when these treatment things like meprovimate came out, it provided them with something that they could use to treat all these patients that came in that had these. They knew what it was as far as this being a psychological entity that produced sometimes physiological symptoms, but at least they now had something clinically that they could say that, okay, well, this is effective in at least the relief and treatment of that. So I was trying to at least point out the medical realities of it, and then with bringing some of the scientific data today, it was more so to show, well, most of what the discourse in the social history of it is it's kind of like a nature versus nurture thing. It's more so that they've been talking about the nurture side of it, and so it's kind of like, well, what about the nature, biological side of it? So that's what I was trying to get to. So hopefully that answers.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very good. Christian.
Well, I was going to ask Dr. Maris to repeat her question.
I guess my question was that at the end you talked about how you could, I think, imagine a space for Disney as as an interpreter of history, and that entertainment could be a valid place for representing American history. And so I wondered how you envision that being done well, because the rest of your presentation and a lot of the examples we've seen have shown some of the problems with doing that. So what would that look like? How would you do that without leaving out all these negative and difficult things, without which American history, of course, is essentially just celebratory and kind of a meaningless thing to study.
And actually, could I just piggyback off of that? Not just American history in and of itself, but America and the world.
Yeah.
Like America and Latin American relations, which
Right.
are
Where's
really
the world?
where it doesn't even talk about, where's the world,
Yeah.
right? When it comes to U.S. and Latin American relations. This is something that you can see in terms of film, if you remember off of Miracle's question.
Probably the world.
Yeah, right. Or it's very segmented.
We are the
And there's
world.
no, yeah, we're the center of it. It's very segmented.
Well, I think that is part of it. I mean, I think because if we're looking at it, we're talking about, they have the Civil War, but I don't think they're actually talking about this. I think they're just doing it as a fun kind of thing. Oh, look, these battle reenactments, look at this.
Lots of fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I'm not talking about it, because that's what they're talking about. They're not having exhibits here saying the first battle of Manassas, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very much, I think, I don't think that necessarily that Michael Eisner was ever going to have, like Colonial Williamsburg put on a slave auction, and it was contested, but it turned out that people were very intrigued by it, and it was actually a very, it was considered a good learning tool, things like that. I mean, digging an Underground Railroad is not going to do that. I mean, I don't think that, I think they are very focused on, or they were very focused on kind of an American exceptionalist kind of part. I think that's what it turned into, was a celebration of America. I think they realized that wasn't their space. They moved to state history, but again, it's celebratory. I don't know that they want to focus on those things, because I don't think they see them as profitable.
One of your most important points, if it's now fully in the paper, is that they tried, but the economy doesn't allow it. So that you can, as a corporation that has to invest that many millions in what you're doing, do what you want to do, because just like with films, people might not go. So that's the tension, right? That I think is an important part of your paper. Even if,
Yeah,
right?
That kind of sort of.
And then Miracle had a question about.
Oh, right. To be honest, I mean, I didn't really look at Disney's attempts at the film, but now I'm just imagining Pocahontas in the Native American village or something. But I mean, I think that's another, that's just another area where you can see there's some clear problems. I mean, honestly, for my career, I didn't look at that space necessarily pretty interesting.
Right. So, any other questions? I would urge you to come up after this panel or at the pizza party if you're going to Dr. Reiter's. I want to thank all the students for doing a wonderful job. And before we clap, I want to thank the faculty. The faculty, because by the time they're getting to senior research, they've taken 9 other classes, sometimes with me, but not that often. And what they're bringing is from everyone else in the faculty who came today. So I appreciate that. And this is a joint product of all of us, right? Yeah.